Hello friends, welcome back to our second lazy history reading. Today we're diving into a fascinating and eerie story about a town that danced itself to death. Sounds creepy, right? It definitely makes you wonder what exactly happened behind this bizarre historical event. But before we start, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Feel free to drop your location in the comments below. It truly brings me joy knowing people from all over the world tune into these videos to relax. I hope you enjoy this story. Alright, let's begin our reading. Imagine this scenario. You wake up one morning in your quiet medieval town. The year is 1518. Outside your window, the cobblestone streets of Strasbourg glisten with morning dew. The air carries the familiar sense of wood smoke, baked bread, and the underlying odor of human desperation that has lingered for months. Your town has been suffering. Crops have failed repeatedly. Disease stalks every neighborhood. Families have been reduced to eating bark and grass to survive. The church promises salvation, but salvation seems very far away in these dark times. Then you see something that will haunt you for the rest of your life. Your neighbor, Frau Trophia, a woman you've known for years, steps into the street and begins to dance. Not the joyful dancing of a festival, not the rhythmic dancing of a celebration. She dances with a desperate, frantic energy, as if her very survival depends on it. Hours pass. She doesn't stop. Days go by. She still can't stop dancing. Her feet begin to bleed. Her breathing becomes labored. Sweat pours from her exhausted body. Yet still, she cannot stop. Soon, more neighbors join her. Dozens, then hundreds. They are not celebrating. They're terrified. Their faces are twisted in anguish, but their bodies won't stop moving. Their limbs jerk and twitch as if controlled by invisible puppeteers. And then, they start dying. This is not a fairy tale. This is not folklore. This is not the product of medieval superstition or exaggerated chronicle writing. This is the true, documented, and completely unsolved story of the dancing plague of 1518 in the city of Strasbourg, France. A story so bizarre, so horrifying, so fundamentally challenging to everything we think we know about human nature, about medicine, about the mysterious forces that can grip entire communities, that it has puzzled historians, doctors, psychologists, and sociologists for more than 500 years. Welcome to one of history's most terrifying medical mysteries, where an entire town danced itself to death, and where the cure prescribed by the authorities was even deadlier than the disease. Chapter 1, setting the stage for madness, the world of 1518. To understand the absolute horror that was about to unfold in the streets of Strasbourg, we must first transport ourselves back to the world of 1518. This was not a time of prosperity and plenty. This was not the Renaissance flowering that we sometimes imagine when we think of early 16th century Europe. This was a world balanced precariously on the edge of collapse. The Holy Roman Empire, of which Strasbourg was a part, was fragmenting under political and religious pressures. The Protestant Reformation was beginning to tear apart the spiritual unity that had defined European civilization for 1,000 years. Martin Luther had posted his 95 Theses just 1 year earlier, in 1517, and the shockwaves were still reverberating across the continent. But for the common people of Strasbourg, theological debates were a luxury they could not afford. They were struggling simply to survive. The city of Strasbourg in 1518 was a major commercial center, strategically located on the Rhine River in what is now the Alsace region, straddling the border between France and Germany. With a population of approximately 20,000 people, it was one of the largest cities in the region, a bustling hub of trade, crafts, and commerce. The city's wealth was built on its position as a crossroads of European trade routes. Merchants from Italy carried spices and silks northward through Strasbourg on their way to the markets of Flanders and England. German craftsmen brought metalwork and textiles southward through the city toward the Mediterranean ports. The Rhine River provided a highway for goods flowing between the Swiss Alps and the North Sea. But beneath the surface of this apparent commercial prosperity, Strasbourg was a city under enormous stress. The years immediately preceding 1518 had been marked by crisis after crisis. The winter of 1550–1516 had been one of the harshest in living memory. with temperatures so low that the Rhine River froze solid, cutting off the waterborne trade that was the lifeblood of the city's economy. Crops failed across the region, leading to severe food shortages. The following year brought different but equally devastating problems. The summer of 1517 was abnormally wet, with torrential rains that flooded the fields and rotted the grain in storage. What little food was available became prohibitively expensive. A loaf of bread that might normally cost a few pfennigs now cost more than a day's wages for a common laborer. Famine stalked the streets of Strasbourg. Families that had been prosperous just a few years earlier found themselves reduced to begging. Children died of malnutrition in numbers not seen since the Black Death 2 centuries before. The poor, already living on the margins of survival, began to disappear entirely. Some fleeing to other cities in search of food, others simply dying quietly in the shadows. Disease followed famine, as it always does. The sweating sickness, a mysterious ailment that could kill within hours of its first symptoms, swept through the cramped quarters where the poor lived. Typhus spread through the overcrowded neighborhoods near the river. Outbreaks of what may have been plague claimed entire families within days. The city's medical infrastructure, such as it was, collapsed under the pressure. Physicians trained in the universities of Paris or Bologna were few and expensive, available only to the wealthy. The common people relied on folk healers, midwives, and barber surgeons whose knowledge was based more on tradition and superstition than on systematic understanding of disease. But perhaps more troubling than the physical hardships was the spiritual crisis that was gripping not just Strasbourg, but all of Europe. This was the age when the medieval certainties were crumbling. The Catholic Church, which had provided both spiritual guidance and social stability for centuries, was under attack from reformers who questioned its fundamental teachings and practices. In Strasbourg, as in many other cities, the new Protestant ideas found fertile ground among people who were already questioning why a benevolent God would allow such suffering to continue. Traditional religious explanations that suffering was punishment for sin, that endurance in this life would be rewarded in the next, began to seem inadequate in the face of such widespread misery. Religious tensions ran high. Catholic clergy preached that the hardships were divine punishment for the city's moral failings. Protestant preachers countered that the suffering was evidence of the Church's corruption and God's displeasure with false teaching. Both sides called for repentance, but offered conflicting visions of what true repentance might look like. The social fabric of the city was straining under these multiple pressures. Traditional hierarchies were breaking down as economic hardship reduced wealthy merchants to poverty and elevated some crafty survivors to unexpected prosperity. Guild structures that had maintained social order for centuries were disrupted by economic chaos and religious division. Crime rates soared as desperate people turned to theft and violence to survive. Public order became increasingly difficult to maintain as the city watched struggled with limited resources and growing social unrest. Beggars filled the streets, many of them former citizens who had lost everything to famine and disease. Into this volatile mixture of physical hardship, economic uncertainty, social disruption, and spiritual confusion, the people of Strasbourg brought their own individual traumas and fears. Every family had lost members to disease or famine. Every household was struggling with poverty and uncertainty about the future. Every person carried the psychological weight of living through what seemed like the end of their world. The mental health of the population was severely compromised. In an age that had no understanding of psychology or psychiatry, people had no framework for understanding or treating the depression, anxiety, and trauma that were epidemic in the city. Suicide rates were high. Cases of what we would now recognize as mental breakdown were common but interpreted through the lens of religion or superstition. Children were particularly vulnerable. Many had witnessed the deaths of parents or siblings. All had grown up during years of hardship and uncertainty. The normal processes of psychological development were disrupted by constant stress and the breakdown of stable family and community structures. Women faced additional pressures in this patriarchal society. They were economically dependent on male relatives who might have died or become unable to work. They were often blamed for family misfortunes and were more likely to be accused of witchcraft when unexplained problems occurred. The combination of economic vulnerability and social scapegoating created intense psychological pressure. The elderly, too, suffered disproportionately. In a society without social safety nets, old age and infirmity often meant destitution and abandonment. Many elderly people found themselves homeless and without support, left to die in the streets or in makeshift shelters. It was into this powder keg of human desperation that a single spark would soon ignite one of the most extraordinary episodes of collective madness in recorded history. The people of Strasbourg had no way of knowing that their suffering was about to take a form that would baffle observers for centuries to come. They could not have imagined that their hunger, their fear, their spiritual anguish would manifest as an irresistible compulsion to dance, and that this dancing would spread through the community like a plague, claiming dozens of lives and leaving the survivors forever changed. The stage was set. The actors were in place. All that was needed was a catalyst. A single person whose individual breakdown would trigger a collective catastrophe that would echo through history. That catalyst was about to arrive in the form of a woman whose name would become synonymous with one of the most bizarre and terrifying events in human history. Her name was Frau Troffea. Chapter 2: The first dancer. Frau Troffea's terrifying debut. On a sweltering day in July 1518, as the summer sun beat down mercilessly on the narrow cobblestone streets of Strasbourg, a woman emerged from her home and unwittingly launched one of history's most perplexing medical mysteries. Frau Troffea was, by all accounts, an unremarkable woman living an unremarkable life in unremarkable times. Historical records tell us frustratingly little about her background, her family, or the circumstances that led to her fateful moment in the street. We know that she was married. The Frau designation tells us that much. We know that she lived in Strasbourg, probably in one of the crowded neighborhoods near the city center where the working poor made their homes. What we don't know, and what historians have spent centuries trying to understand, is what drove her to step out of her house that July morning and begin the dance that would change her life forever. The contemporary chroniclers who documented the event tell us that it began without warning. Frau Troffea simply walked into the street, positioned herself in a small square near her home, and began to move. But this was not dancing as we might understand it today. This was not the graceful, rhythmic movement of a trained performer, nor the joyful expression of someone celebrating a special occasion. Witnesses described her movements as frantic, desperate, almost violent in their intensity. Her arms flailed wildly in the air as if she were trying to fight off invisible attackers. Her feet moved in rapid, jerky steps that seemed to follow no pattern or rhythm. Her head jerked from side to side, and her hair came loose from its covering to whip around her face. Her mouth was open, gasping for air, but no sound emerged except for labored breathing. Most disturbing of all was her face. Those who saw her in those first hours said that her expression was not one of joy or abandon, but of terror and confusion. Her eyes were wide with fear, as if she were as shocked by her own behavior as the people watching her. She seemed to be fighting against her own body, struggling to regain control of limbs that no longer obeyed her conscious will. She danced, and she could not stop. The first witnesses gathered quickly. In a medieval city like Strasbourg, unusual events drew crowds within minutes. People working in nearby shops left their counters to see what was happening. Children playing in the street stopped their games to stare. Housewives interrupted their daily tasks to peer out of windows and doorways. Initially, the reaction was mixed. Some laughed, assuming they were witnessing a moment of temporary madness that would soon pass. Others crossed themselves and muttered prayers, suspecting supernatural intervention. A few tried to approach Frau Troffea, perhaps to offer help or to physically restrain her, but she danced away from them, seemingly unable to control her movements, but still able to avoid contact with others. As the hours passed and Frau Troffea continued her frantic movement, the laughter died away. This was clearly not a prank or a momentary lapse. Something was seriously wrong. Medieval medicine had no framework for understanding what was happening. The dominant medical theory of the time was based on the ancient Greek concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this system, illness resulted from imbalances among these bodily fluids. Mental disturbances were typically attributed either to humoral imbalances or to supernatural causes: divine punishment for sin, demonic possession, or the influence of malevolent magic. As word spread through the city, people began to offer their own explanations for Frau Troffea's condition. Some suggested that she had been cursed by an enemy, perhaps as revenge for some perceived slight. Others wondered if she had committed a grave sin that was now being punished through divine intervention. Still others whispered about demonic possession, noting that her movements seemed beyond human control. Religious authorities were summoned to examine her, but they too were baffled. Prayers were offered, holy water was sprinkled, religious relics were brought close to her, but nothing had any effect. She continued to dance with the same frantic energy, as if driven by forces that were immune to spiritual intervention. Physicians were called, but their examinations proved equally fruitless. They could find no physical injury or obvious illness that might explain her behavior. Her pulse was rapid from exertion, but otherwise her vital signs seemed normal. She appeared to be physically healthy, which made her condition even more puzzling. As the first day wore on, Frau Trofia's condition began to take a visible toll. The constant movement was exhausting. Sweat poured from her body, soaking through her clothing. Her breathing became increasingly labored. Her feet, confined in the rough leather shoes typical of the time, began to show signs of wear from the constant contact with the cobblestones, yet she could not stop. Night fell, but Frau Trofia continued to dance in the darkness. Torches were brought to provide light, and a continuous vigil began. Family members, neighbors, and curious onlookers took turns watching over her, unsure what else to do. Some tried to offer her food and water, which she consumed without interrupting her movement, gulping down sustenance while her feet continued their relentless pattern. The psychological impact on the observers was profound. Many had never seen anything like this before. The sight of a fellow human being trapped in such an obviously distressing condition, yet unable to stop herself, was deeply unsettling. Some people fled, unable to bear watching her suffer. Others became obsessed with the spectacle, returning again and again to check on her progress. The second day brought no relief. If anything, Frau Trofia's movements seemed to become more intense, as if the compulsion was strengthening rather than weakening over time. Her clothes began to tear from the constant motion. Her shoes started to fall apart, exposing her feet to direct contact with the rough stones of the street. By the third day, blood began to appear. Her feet, now essentially bare, were being abraded by the cobblestones with each step. Dark stains appeared on the ground where she danced, marking the spot where one woman's inexplicable suffering was playing out in full view of an entire community. The crowd that gathered to watch her grew larger each day. People came from across the city and even from neighboring towns to witness this unprecedented spectacle. Some came out of simple curiosity. Others were drawn by religious fervor, believing they were witnessing either a miracle or a manifestation of divine wrath. Still others came seeking their own healing, hoping that proximity to such an extraordinary event might somehow cure their own ailments. Local clergy began to incorporate Frau Trofia's condition into their sermons, using her as an example of various spiritual truths. Some preached that she was being punished for hidden sins, urging their congregations to examine their own consciences. Others suggested that she was experiencing a form of divine ecstasy, albeit a painful one. A few even proposed that she might be a saint in the making, suffering for the redemption of the community. The medical community was equally divided. Some physicians insisted that her condition was purely physical, caused by an imbalance of humors that would eventually correct itself. Others believed they were witnessing a supernatural phenomenon that lay outside the realm of natural medicine. A few suggested that she might be feigning her condition for attention, though this theory became harder to maintain as her physical deterioration became obvious. But as the days passed and Frau Trofia's solitary dance continued, something even more extraordinary and more terrifying began to happen. Others began to join her. It started with just one person, a young man who had been among the crowd of observers. He had been watching Frau Trofia intently for hours, his face showing the same mixture of fascination and horror that had become common among the spectators. Then, without warning, he too began to dance. Chapter 3. The contagion spreads when dancing becomes epidemic. The transformation from individual tragedy to collective catastrophe began subtly, almost imperceptibly. On the fourth day of Frau Trofia's endless dance, a young man who had been among the crowd of observers suddenly stepped forward and began to move in the same frantic and controlled manner. His name has been lost to history, but witnesses described him as a laborer, perhaps a blacksmith or carpenter, with the calloused hands and muscular build of someone accustomed to physical work. He had been watching Frau Trofia intently for hours, his face showing a mixture of fascination and horror that had become common among the spectators. Then, without warning, he began to dance. His movements were different from Frau Trofia's, more violent, more aggressive, but they shared the same quality of being beyond the dancer's conscious control. His arms swung wildly, sometimes striking his own body with enough force to leave bruises. His legs carried him in erratic patterns that seemed to follow no logic except the internal rhythm that now possessed him. Like Frau Trofia, his face showed not joy but terror. He seemed as shocked by his own actions as the people around him. Several witnesses reported that he cried out for help in those first moments, begging someone to make him stop, but his pleas were ignored as his body continued its relentless movement. Within hours, a third person joined the dance, then a fourth, then more. By the end of the first week, contemporary chroniclers report that more than 30 people were dancing uncontrollably in the streets of Strasbourg. The pattern of contagion was unlike anything medical authorities had seen before. This was not spreading like a typical disease through physical contact or contaminated air or water. Instead, it seemed to spread through observation, through some kind of psychological or spiritual mechanism that medieval science was completely unable to understand. The psychological mechanism at work here is what modern researchers call mass psychogenic illness or epidemic hysteria. This phenomenon occurs when physical symptoms spread through a population without any identifiable biological cause. Instead, the symptoms are transmitted through social and psychological channels, often affecting individuals who are already under significant stress or who identify strongly with the initial victims. The conditions in Strasbourg were perfect for this type of outbreak. The population was under enormous stress from years of famine, disease, and social upheaval. People were psychologically vulnerable, struggling with depression, anxiety, and trauma that they had no framework for understanding or treating. The sight of Frau Trofia's uncontrolled dancing may have triggered similar breakdowns in individuals who were already on the edge of psychological collapse. But the medieval mind had no concept of mass psychogenic illness. To the people of Strasbourg, the spreading dance mania seemed to confirm their worst fears about supernatural intervention in human affairs. If one person could be possessed by demons or cursed by enemies, then surely the same forces could affect multiple people. The dancers came from all walks of life. There were men and women, young and old, rich and poor. Some were respected members of the community, merchants, craftsmen, even a few from noble families. Others were from the margins of society, beggars, laborers, people whose names were barely known even to their neighbors. What they shared was not social class or occupation or family connection, but rather a certain psychological vulnerability that made them susceptible to whatever force was driving the dancing mania. Many were people who had suffered particularly severe losses during the recent years of famine and disease. Some were known to have struggled with melancholy or other forms of mental distress. Others were deeply religious individuals who may have interpreted the dancing as a form of divine calling or penance. The spread of the dancing plague followed predictable patterns that we can now understand in terms of social psychology and group dynamics. People who spent more time observing the dancers were more likely to become dancers themselves. Those who were already emotionally stressed or socially isolated were more vulnerable. Individuals who had strong emotional or spiritual connections to the original dancers were more likely to be affected. Religious and superstitious thinking also played a role in the spread. Some people may have convinced themselves that they were called to join the dancing as a form of penance or religious devotion. Others may have believed that they were being punished for their sins and that the dancing was inevitable. These beliefs could create a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the expectation of becoming a dancer actually triggered the psychological breakdown that made it happen. As the number of dancers grew, the city authorities began to recognize that they were facing a crisis unlike anything in their experience. This was not a riot that could be suppressed by force, nor an outbreak of conventional disease that could be quarantined. This was something entirely new, a form of mass madness that seemed to feed on itself, growing stronger and more widespread with each passing day. The economic impact was immediate and severe. The dancers were unable to work, unable to contribute to their families' welfare or the city's productivity. Shops and workshops that had been struggling to survive in the difficult economic conditions now found themselves without key workers. Families that had been barely managing to feed themselves now had to care for relatives who consumed food and attention but could contribute nothing in return. The psychological impact was even more devastating. The sight of dozens of people dancing uncontrollably created an atmosphere of terror and uncertainty that affected everyone in the city. Parents kept their children indoors, afraid they might be infected by whatever was causing the dancing. Merchants began to avoid Strasbourg, unwilling to risk exposure to what many saw as a supernatural curse. Religious services were disrupted as parishioners became too frightened to gather in large groups. Some churches reported that their attendance dropped to almost nothing as people became convinced that communal religious activities might somehow trigger the dancing plague. Other congregations experienced the opposite problem, with people flocking to churches in desperate search of protection from what they saw as supernatural evil. The social fabric of the community began to unravel. Neighbors who had lived peacefully together for years began to suspect each other of witchcraft or cursing. Families were torn apart as some members joined the dancing while others remained unaffected. The normal rhythms of daily life were disrupted as more and more people either became dancers themselves or devoted their time to caring for affected relatives. The dancers themselves were suffering terribly. The physical toll of continuous movement was enormous. Within days, many showed signs of severe exhaustion. Their clothes became soaked with sweat and torn from the constant motion. Their feet became raw and bleeding from contact with the cobblestones. Dehydration became a constant threat, as did malnutrition, since it was difficult to consume adequate food while maintaining the relentless dance. Yet they could not stop. Every attempt to restrain them physically resulted in violent struggling, as if their bodies were fighting to continue the movement even against their own conscious will. Some dancers reported later, when they had recovered, that they had been fully aware of what was happening to them but had been completely unable to control their actions. They described feeling like prisoners in their own bodies, forced to watch helplessly as their limbs moved according to some external compulsion. The medical authorities of Strasbourg were completely baffled. They had been trained in the universities of Europe according to the best knowledge of their time, but the knowledge provided no framework for understanding what they were witnessing. The theory of the four humors suggested that such violent movement might be caused by an excess of blood that had become overheated, but the treatments based on this diagnosis, bloodletting, purging, cooling remedies, had no effect whatsoever. Some physicians theorized that the dancers were suffering from a form of divine possession, similar to the religious ecstasies experienced by some Christian mystics. But the dancers showed none of the spiritual joy or revelation typically associated with such experiences. Instead, they appeared to be in agony, trapped in an endless cycle of movement that brought them no pleasure or peace. Religious authorities were equally puzzled. Prayers, exorcisms, and holy relics seemed to have no effect on the dancers. Some clergy suggested that the dancing was a form of penance, a way for the afflicted to atone for their sins through physical suffering. Others saw it as divine punishment, evidence that God was displeased with the city's moral condition. Still others wondered if it might be the work of Satan, a demonic attack designed to destroy the community's faith and social order. As the second week began and the number of dancers continued to grow, panic began to set in among the general population. Wild theories circulated through the city. Some believed that the dancing was connected to the recent religious upheavals, that Protestant ideas had somehow unleashed supernatural forces that were now punishing the faithful. Others suspected that enemies of the city had employed witchcraft or poisoning to create the crisis. The city council, composed of merchants and guildmasters who were accustomed to dealing with practical problems of trade and governance, found themselves completely out of their depth. They had no precedent for handling a situation like this, no established procedures for dealing with mass psychological breakdown. In their desperation, they turned to the medical experts of their time for advice. What they received would prove to be not just wrong, but catastrophically, tragically wrong. Chapter 4: The Deadly Cure When Medicine Becomes Murder. The decision that would transform the dancing plague from a local tragedy into a historical catastrophe was made in the council chambers of Strasbourg sometime during the second week of July 1518. The city's leaders, merchants, guild masters, and civic officials who had spent their careers dealing with practical problems of trade, taxation, and public order, found themselves facing a situation that defied all of their experience and expertise. Dozens of their fellow citizens were dancing uncontrollably in the streets. The number was growing daily. The economic and social disruption was severe. Panic was spreading through the population. Something had to be done. In their desperation, the city council turned to the highest medical authorities available to them. These were learned men, trained in the great universities of Europe, versed in the classical texts of Galen and Hippocrates, and experienced in treating the ailments that commonly afflicted medieval populations. If anyone could provide a solution to this unprecedented crisis, surely it would be these respected physicians. The medical consultation that followed represents one of the most tragic examples in history of how good intentions, combined with fundamentally flawed understanding, can lead to catastrophic results. The physicians examined the dancers carefully, observing their symptoms and comparing what they saw to the medical theories of their time. The dominant framework for understanding illness in 1518 was the ancient Greek theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this system, health depended on maintaining a proper balance among these bodily fluids, while illness resulted from various forms of imbalance. When the doctors observed the frantic, continuous movement of the dancers, they saw symptoms that seemed to fit clearly into this theoretical framework: the constant motion, the elevated heart rate, the flushed appearance of many dancers. All of these suggested to medieval medical minds an excess of blood that had become dangerously overheated. Hot blood was a recognized medical condition in 1518. It was believed to cause a variety of symptoms, including restlessness, agitation, and an irresistible urge to move. The recommended treatment was based on logical principles that made perfect sense within the context of humoral theory. The excess hot blood needed to be expelled from the body through vigorous physical activity. In other words, the cure for uncontrollable dancing was more dancing. The physicians reasoned that if the dancers could be encouraged to move more efficiently and more vigorously, they would exhaust their supply of overheated blood more quickly and thus achieve a cure more rapidly. The random, chaotic movements they were currently displaying were inefficient. What was needed was organized, sustained, rhythmic dancing that would more effectively purge the hot blood from their systems. Based on this diagnosis, the medical experts made their recommendation to the city council. Instead of trying to stop the dancers, the authorities should facilitate and encourage their movement. Professional musicians should be hired to provide proper musical accompaniment. Stages should be constructed to give the dancers adequate space and to protect them from the rough cobblestones. Professional dancers should be brought in to provide instruction in proper technique. The city council, faced with a crisis they did not understand and lacking any alternative plan, accepted this medical advice. They authorized the expenditure of significant public funds to implement what they believed would be an effective treatment program for the dancing plague. The implementation of this cure began within days. City workers were dispatched to clear out the guild hall, creating a large indoor space where the dancers could move safely. Carpenters were hired to construct wooden stages in the public squares, elevating the dancers and protecting their feet from the stones. Musicians were recruited from across the region. Pipers, drummers, lute players, anyone who could provide the rhythmic accompaniment that the physicians had prescribed. Most remarkably, the city authorities hired professional dancers, skilled performers who were brought in specifically to teach the afflicted how to dance more effectively. These instructors were tasked with demonstrating proper footwork, arm movements, and breathing techniques that would help the dancers pace themselves and avoid injury while purging their systems of hot blood. The transformation of Strasbourg was immediate and dramatic. What had been a medical emergency was now being treated as a public festival. Crowds gathered to watch the organized dancing, cheering on the performers and enjoying the musical entertainment that accompanied the treatment. The atmosphere became festive, even celebratory, as if the community were witnessing not suffering but a grand spectacle. But beneath the surface of this organized entertainment, a far more sinister process was taking place. The medical intervention, rather than curing the dancing plague, was making it exponentially worse. The constant music provided a rhythmic framework that had been missing from the dance's previous chaotic movement. Instead of the random, exhausting flailing that had characterized their earlier symptoms, they now had a steady beat to follow, a musical structure that made their dancing more sustainable and, paradoxically, more addictive. The psychological mechanisms at work here are well understood by modern researchers. Music has powerful effects on the human brain, triggering the release of neurotransmitters like dopamine that create feelings of pleasure and reward. For people who were already in a psychologically vulnerable state, the combination of rhythmic music and social attention could create a powerful reinforcement cycle that made stopping the dancing even more difficult. The public attention and encouragement created powerful psychological incentives to continue dancing. The dancers were no longer isolated victims of a mysterious ailment, they had become performers in a citywide spectacle. The cheers and applause from the audience, the attention from the musicians and dance instructors, the sense of being part of something larger than themselves. All of these factors combined to make stopping even more difficult than before. The professional instruction, intended to help the dancers move more efficiently, actually taught them techniques that allowed them to sustain their movement for longer periods. Instead of dancing themselves to quick exhaustion and recovery, they were now able to pace themselves to maintain their frantic activity for days or even weeks at a time. Most tragically, the public nature of the dancing created a powerful mechanism for the plague to spread to new victims. People who had been merely observers found themselves drawn into the movement, either through psychological contagion or through the social pressure to participate in what appeared to be a community celebration. The social dynamics of the situation had completely changed. What had begun as a medical crisis had become a public entertainment. The boundary between audience and performer began to blur as spectators found themselves unconsciously moving to the rhythm of the music. Some people who had come to watch ended up joining the dance, unable to resist the psychological pull of the music and the crowd. Within days of the implementation of the city's treatment program, the number of dancers had grown from dozens to hundreds. By some accounts, as many as 400 people were eventually caught up in the dancing mania, roughly 2% of Strasbourg's entire population. The physical toll on the dancers became increasingly severe as the days passed. The organized dancing was in some ways more punishing than the chaotic movement that had preceded it. The constant rhythm meant there were no natural breaks, no pauses for rest. The public setting made it difficult for dancers to seek privacy for basic bodily functions. The competitive atmosphere, as dancers seemed to compete for attention and approval from the audience, pushed many to extremes of exertion that their bodies could not sustain. The authorities, rather than recognizing that their treatment was making the situation worse, doubled down on their medical approach. When dancers collapsed, they were given brief rests and then encouraged to resume movement as soon as possible. When new victims appeared, they were immediately incorporated into the organized dancing program. Physicians continued to insist that more vigorous dancing was the only path to cure. The festival atmosphere that surrounded the dancing began to take on increasingly disturbing characteristics. What had started as a community response to a medical crisis was becoming a form of entertainment that depended on human suffering. Vendors set up stalls around the dancing areas, selling food and drink to the spectators. Gambling began on which dancers would last the longest or perform most dramatically. Some observers began to express doubts about the treatment program, noting that the dancers seemed to be getting worse rather than better. But these voices were drowned out by the medical authorities, who insisted that the treatment was working and that any worsening of symptoms was simply part of the healing process. Religious leaders were divided about the spectacle. Some saw it as a manifestation of divine will that should not be interfered with. Others were disturbed by what they perceived as the transformation of human suffering into entertainment. A few brave clergy members spoke out against the treatment program, but they were largely ignored by the secular authorities who had committed themselves to the medical approach. The economic impact of the expanded dancing program was severe. The city was spending enormous amounts of money on musicians, dancers, stage construction, and other aspects of the treatment program. At the same time, hundreds of citizens were unable to work, creating a massive drain on the city's productivity and resources. Families were being torn apart by the crisis. Some members joined the dancing while others remained unaffected, creating divisions and conflicts within households. The constant presence of crowds and music in the public spaces disrupted normal patterns of work and social interaction. Children were particularly affected, as schools closed and normal educational and social activities were suspended. By the end of July 1518, just 3 weeks after Frau Trofia had first stepped into the street, the dancing plague had become a full-scale epidemic that was consuming the city's resources and destroying its social fabric. The death toll was mounting daily as dancers collapsed from exhaustion, dehydration, and the various medical complications that resulted from weeks of continuous movement. And through it all, the music played on, and the dancing continued, and the authorities continued to insist that their treatment was the only hope for a cure. What had begun as one woman's inexplicable breakdown had become, through the well-intentioned but catastrophically wrong intervention of medical authorities, one of the deadliest episodes of mass hysteria in recorded history. The cure had become far deadlier than the disease. Chapter 5: The Body Count Death Dances in the Streets. By the beginning of August 1518, the organized dancing that the city authorities had implemented as a cure had become a machinery of death. The stages erected in the public squares had become platforms of suffering, where exhausted bodies moved in endless, rhythmic torment while crowds watched what had become a grotesque spectacle of human endurance pushed beyond all reasonable limits. Contemporary chronicles from Strasbourg paint a picture of horror that seems almost impossible to believe. Yet multiple independent sources confirm the basic facts. Hundreds of people were dancing continuously, day and night, for weeks on end, and many of them were dying from the exertion. The human body is simply not designed to sustain the kind of continuous physical activity that the dancing plague demanded. Modern medicine understands the physiological limits of human endurance. The cardiovascular, muscular, and neurological systems all have breaking points beyond which they cannot function safely. The dancers of Strasbourg were being pushed far, far beyond these limits, with predictably tragic results. The most common cause of death among the dancers was cardiovascular failure. Hearts that were already weakened by years of poor nutrition and the stress of living through famine and disease simply could not maintain the pace demanded by weeks of continuous dancing. The combination of constant physical exertion, dehydration, and the psychological stress of being unable to control their own bodies created perfect conditions for cardiac episodes. Contemporary accounts describe dancers suddenly stopping mid-movement, clutching their chests, and collapsing to the wooden platforms. Some died instantly, their hearts simply giving out after days or weeks of being pushed beyond their limits. Others lingered for hours or days, their damaged cardiovascular systems unable to recover from the extreme stress they had endured. The sight of dancers collapsing mid-movement became tragically common. Witnesses described the horrible moment when a person who had been moving frantically would suddenly clutch their chest, the face contorting in pain before crumpling to the ground. The music would continue playing, other dancers would step around the fallen body, and the macabre spectacle would go on. Strokes were another major killer. The combination of dehydration, elevated blood pressure from continuous exertion, and the formation of blood clots created ideal conditions for cerebrovascular accidents. Dancers would suddenly lose control of part of their bodies, not because their compulsion to dance had ended, but because blood clots had cut off circulation to critical parts of their brains. The sight of dancers whose compulsion continued even after they had suffered strokes was particularly horrifying to witnesses. These individuals might lose the use of an arm or leg, or suffer facial paralysis, yet their bodies would continue trying to maintain the dancing motion with whatever limbs still functioned. Some danced with one side of their body paralyzed, their functioning limbs still moving in desperate rhythm while the damaged portions hung limp and useless. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke claimed many victims, particularly during the hottest days of late July and August. Dancing continuously under the summer sun, often while wearing the heavy clothing typical of the medieval period, caused dangerous increases in body temperature that the body's cooling mechanisms could not handle. Dancers would become confused and disoriented as their brain function was impaired by overheating, yet they could not stop moving even as their internal temperature reached lethal levels. The stages and public squares where the dancing took place became furnaces of human suffering. The wooden platforms, heated by the sun and the constant friction of hundreds of feet, became scorching hot. Dancers' feet were burned by contact with the overheated wood, adding thermal injury to the cuts and abrasions they were already suffering from the continuous movement. Dehydration was a constant threat that proved nearly impossible to manage effectively. While efforts were made to provide the dancers with water, it proved nearly impossible to ensure adequate fluid intake for people who could not stop moving. Many dancers became severely dehydrated, leading to kidney problems, confusion, and eventually complete organ failure. The challenge of providing adequate nutrition to people who could not stop moving proved equally difficult. Dancers lost weight rapidly as they burned enormous numbers of calories through continuous movement. Some wasted away before the eyes of their families, becoming skeletal figures who continued to move even as their bodies consumed themselves for fuel. Contemporary chroniclers report that at the height of the epidemic, approximately 15 people per day were dying from complications related to the dancing mania. To put this in perspective, that would be equivalent to more than 5,000 deaths per year from this single cause in a city of only 20,000 people. that the raw numbers, shocking as they are, don't capture the full horror of what was happening. These were not anonymous statistics. These were real people with families, with hopes and dreams, with lives that were being destroyed by forces they could not understand or control. Consider the story of Margaret, a baker's wife whose name appears in one surviving chronicle. She joined the dancing plague in its third week, drawn in by watching her neighbor's endless movement. For 6 days, she danced continuously while her husband and children watched helplessly. On the 7th day, she collapsed from a heart attack and died on the wooden stage while the music continued to play around her body. Her children, traumatized by watching their mother's public death, were left orphaned when their father abandoned them and fled the city. Or consider young Hans, an apprentice cobbler who was barely 16 when he began dancing. His master later wrote that the boy had seemed perfectly healthy, full of life and energy. But after 2 weeks of continuous movement, Hans began showing signs of severe malnutrition and dehydration. His master tried to force-feed him, but Hans could not stop moving long enough to consume adequate nutrition. He died of starvation while still dancing, his emaciated body finally giving out after burning through all of its energy reserves. These individual tragedies played out dozens of times during the epidemic. Families watched helplessly as their loved ones danced themselves to death. Parents buried children, children became orphans, and spouses were widowed by a condition that no one understood and no one could cure. The authorities, rather than recognizing the deadly consequences of their treatment, continued to insist that the dancing cure was working. When dancers died, physicians explained their deaths as evidence that the treatment had been successful. The deceased had finally expelled all of their hot blood and achieved a cure, albeit at the cost of their lives. This horrific logic allowed the medical authorities to interpret even the most obvious failures of their treatment as successes. Dead dancers were not seen as victims of medical malpractice but as martyrs who had sacrificed their lives to rid their bodies of corrupted humors. The mounting death toll, rather than causing the physicians to question their approach, was seen as proof that the condition had been even more serious than they had initially realized. The public spectacle aspect of the deaths made the trauma even worse for survivors and witnesses. These people were not dying quietly in their beds, surrounded by family and attended by physicians. They were dying in full view of hundreds of spectators, their final moments becoming part of the public entertainment that the dancing plague had become. Some observers began to express horror at what they were witnessing. A few brave individuals spoke out against the treatment program, arguing that it was making the crisis worse rather than better. But these voices were overwhelmed by the medical authorities and civic leaders who had committed themselves to the dancing cure and were unwilling to admit that they had made a catastrophic mistake. The deaths created new problems for the city. Bodies had to be removed from the dancing areas quickly to maintain the fiction that the treatment was successful. Families had to be prevented from disrupting the ongoing dancing to mourn their dead relatives. The normal rituals of death and burial were suspended or modified to accommodate the continuing spectacle. Mass graves were dug outside the city to accommodate the mounting casualties. These burial sites became a grim testament to the epidemic's toll, filled with the bodies of people who had died not from disease or old age, but from an uncontrollable compulsion to move that had literally danced them to death. Chapter 6: The End of the Dance and the Search for Explanations. After weeks of continuous dancing and mounting deaths, something finally began to change in Strasbourg. The exact timeline varies in different historical accounts, but most sources agree that the dancing mania began to subside in late August or early September 1518. The end did not come all at once. Gradually, individual dancers began to stop their movement. Some collapsed from exhaustion and did not resume dancing when they recovered. Others seemed to simply lose the compulsion, as if whatever force had been driving them suddenly released its grip. Religious authorities later claimed credit for ending the plague. They organized special prayers, processions, and religious ceremonies designed to drive out whatever evil influence had taken hold of the city. The dancers who were still alive were taken to holy sites, where prayers were offered for their recovery. Many were taken to the shrine of St. Vitus in Hohenlandsberg, about 50 miles from Strasbourg. St. Vitus was a Christian martyr who was believed to have special power over dancing manias and similar afflictions. The irony was not lost on later historians that St. Vitus was also the patron saint of the neurological disorder that bears his name, Sydenham's chorea, which causes involuntary jerking movements similar to dance-like motions. Whether through religious intervention, medical treatment, or simply the natural course of whatever had caused the crisis, the dancing gradually ceased. The stages were dismantled, the musicians were dismissed, and the streets of Strasbourg slowly returned to normal. But the questions remained. What had caused hundreds of people to dance uncontrollably for weeks? Why had the crisis emerged in Strasbourg at that particular time? And most importantly, could it happen again? Over the centuries since 1518, scholars, doctors, and historians have proposed numerous theories to explain the dancing plague. Each theory has its supporters and its critics, but none has provided a completely satisfactory explanation for all the documented aspects of the event. The mass hysteria theory. The most widely accepted explanation today is that the dancing plague was an example of mass psychogenic illness, also known as mass hysteria. This psychological phenomenon occurs when symptoms of illness spread through a population without an identifiable physical cause. Mass hysteria typically occurs in communities under severe stress, exactly the conditions that existed in Strasbourg in 1518. The city had endured years of famine, disease, and social upheaval. The population was psychologically primed for a collective breakdown. The theory suggests that Frau Trofia's initial dancing episode was triggered by individual psychological stress, perhaps related to personal trauma or religious guilt. Her public display of distress then triggered similar episodes in other psychologically vulnerable individuals, creating a cascade effect that eventually affected hundreds of people. Modern researchers have documented many similar cases of mass psychogenic illness. In 1962, a factory in Tanzania experienced an outbreak of uncontrollable laughter that affected over 1,000 people and forced the closure of several schools. In 1983, a group of Palestinian schoolgirls began fainting and experiencing other symptoms after reporting a strange smell, leading to mass evacuations and medical investigations that found no physical cause. These modern cases share several key features with the dancing plague. They occur in stressed populations, they spread through social contact and observation, they affect people who are already psychologically vulnerable, and they eventually resolve spontaneously without specific medical treatment. The mass hysteria theory accounts for several key features of the dancing plague: the gradual spread from person to person, the lack of any identifiable physical cause, the fact that it affected people across different social classes and age groups, and the eventual spontaneous resolution of the crisis. However, critics of the mass hysteria theory point out that it doesn't fully explain the extreme physical nature of the symptoms. Most cases of mass hysteria involve relatively mild symptoms that don't typically result in death. The dancing plague involved weeks of continuous movement that killed dozens of people, a level of physical symptom that seems to go beyond typical psychological illness. The ergot poisoning theory. Another theory suggests that the dancing plague was caused by ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, particularly in wet conditions. When consumed, ergot produces compounds that are chemically similar to LSD, causing hallucinations, convulsions, and spasmodic movement. Ergotism was a known problem in medieval Europe, where it was called St. Anthony's fire. The symptoms of ergot poisoning include hallucinations, seizures, and involuntary muscle contractions that could potentially be mistaken for dancing. The summer of 1518 had been particularly wet in the Alsace region, creating ideal conditions for ergot growth on grain crops. If the bread consumed in Strasbourg had been contaminated with ergot, it could potentially explain the dancing symptoms. Ergot poisoning can cause powerful hallucinations that might explain why the dancers seemed to be responding to music or rhythms that others couldn't hear. The compound lysergic acid, found in ergot, is closely related to LSD and can produce intense sensory experiences and loss of impulse control. However, the ergot theory has several significant problems. First, ergot poisoning typically affects people with severe convulsions and seizures, not the sustained, rhythmic movements described in the dancing plague. The movements associated with ergotism are usually brief, violent spasms rather than the continuous dancing that characterized the Strasbourg epidemic. Second, ergot poisoning usually involves intense pain and burning sensations, symptoms that were not prominently reported in the Strasbourg case. People suffering from ergotism typically experience excruciating pain in their extremities as blood vessels constrict and circulation is cut off. Most critically, ergot poisoning affects people who consume contaminated grain, but the dancing plague spread in patterns that look more like social contagion than food poisoning. If ergot had been the cause, we would expect to see entire families evicted at once, since they would have shared meals prepared from the same contaminated grain. Instead, the pattern of spread looked much more like psychological contagion, affecting individuals who spent time observing other dancers. The religious cult theory. A third theory suggests that the dancing plague was actually a religious ritual that got out of control. Some medieval Christian sects practiced ecstatic dancing as a form of worship, believing that intense physical movement could bring them closer to God or purge them of sin. There is historical evidence of similar dancing manias occurring in religious contexts throughout medieval Europe. Some involved groups of pilgrims who danced their way from town to town. Others were associated with heretical sects that believed physical suffering could lead to spiritual purification. The theory suggests that the dancing plague might have begun as a religious ritual practiced by a secret cult in Strasbourg, but then spread to the general population either through recruitment or imitation. The authorities' decision to encourage the dancing might have been based on recognition that it had religious significance. The religious context of the time supports this theory to some extent. The Protestant Reformation was just beginning, and there was considerable religious turmoil and experimentation with new forms of worship. Some people might have seen the dancing as a form of religious expression that was more authentic than the formal rituals of the established church. However, the evidence for organized religious activity during the dancing plague is weak. Contemporary accounts describe the dancing as chaotic and unorganized, not the structured ritual one would expect from an established religious practice. There is no evidence of religious leaders organizing or directing the dancing, and no reports of religious ceremonies or beliefs specifically associated with the event. The neurological disease theory. Some historians have suggested that the dancing plague might have been an outbreak of Sydenham's chorea, a neurological disorder also known as St. Vitus dance. This condition causes rapid, involuntary jerking movements that can resemble dancing. Sydenham's chorea is associated with rheumatic fever and streptococcal infections, both of which were common in medieval Europe. An outbreak of rheumatic fever could potentially have affected multiple people in Strasbourg, causing similar neurological symptoms. The disorder primarily affects children and adolescents, and some accounts of the dancing plague mention young people among the victims. The movements associated with chorea can be sustained and rhythmic, potentially matching some descriptions of the dancing. However, Sydenham's chorea doesn't typically cause the sustained, continuous movement described in the dancing plague. The symptoms of chorea are usually intermittent and don't typically result in a kind of exhaustion and death that characterize the Strasbourg event. Additionally, chorea doesn't spread from person to person through observation, which was clearly a feature of the dancing plague. Neurological diseases spread through biological mechanisms, not through social contact. Chapter 7: Modern Medical Perspectives and Analysis. Today's medical professionals who have studied the dancing plague tend to favor a multifactorial explanation. Rather than attributing the event to a single cause, they suggest that it probably resulted from a combination of psychological, social, and possibly physical factors. The severe social stress in Strasbourg created conditions favorable for mass psychological illness. Individual cases of genuine mental illness, possibly triggered by malnutrition or infection, might have provided the initial spark that ignited a broader social contagion. The authorities' misguided medical treatment then amplified and prolonged the crisis. This multifactorial approach acknowledges that historical events, especially ones involving large numbers of people, rarely have simple, single explanations. The dancing plague was probably the result of multiple factors converging in a perfect storm of medieval misunderstanding and suffering. Modern understanding of stress and trauma helps explain why the dancing plague occurred when and where it did. The population of Strasbourg in 1518 was suffering from what we would now recognize as collective trauma. Years of famine, disease, and social upheaval had created widespread post-traumatic stress, depression, and anxiety. In a population already pushed to the breaking point, a single dramatic incident, Frau Troffia's mysterious dancing, could have served as a trigger for mass psychological breakdown. People who were already struggling with their own mental health issues might have identified with her distress and unconsciously adopted similar symptoms. The social and cultural context also played a crucial role. Medieval people had a very different understanding of the relationship between mind and body than we do today. They were more likely to interpret psychological distress as physical illness or supernatural intervention. This worldview might have made them more susceptible to developing physical symptoms in response to psychological stress. The authorities' response, while well-intentioned, created a feedback loop that made the crisis much worse. By treating the dancing as a physical condition that required more dancing to cure, they transformed individual psychological breakdowns into a community-wide spectacle that encouraged more people to join in. Modern research on mass psychogenic illness has identified several factors that make communities more vulnerable to such outbreaks: social stress, exposure to media coverage of similar events, closed communities with strong social bonds, and authority figures who validate the symptoms as real and serious. All of these factors were present in Strasbourg in 1518. The population was under severe stress, the dancing received enormous attention and publicity, the city was a relatively closed community where everyone knew everyone else, and the medical authorities confirmed that the dancing was a serious condition requiring treatment. Chapter 8: The Legacy and Lessons of the Dancing Plague. The dancing plague of Strasbourg did not end with the last dancer finally coming to rest. Its effects rippled through the community for years, and its lessons continue to resonate with us today. In the immediate aftermath of the crisis, Strasbourg struggled to understand what had happened and how to prevent it from happening again. The massive death toll had devastated many families, and the economic disruption had lasting effects on the city's prosperity. The religious response was complex and contradictory. Some church leaders declared the dancing plague to have been divine punishment for the city's sins, calling for increased piety and moral reform. Others saw it as a test of faith that the community had ultimately passed through God's grace. Special religious observances were established to commemorate the event and hopefully prevent its recurrence. Prayers to Saint Vitus became more common, and the saint's shrine became a pilgrimage destination for people suffering from similar conditions. The medical community was forced to confront the limitations of their knowledge and methods. The complete failure of the hot blood theory and the dancing cure could not be ignored. Some physicians began to question whether mental afflictions might require different treatments than physical diseases. However, the development of more effective medical understanding would take centuries. The concept of psychological illness as distinct from spiritual or moral failing was still far in the future. Medieval medicine would continue to rely on theories of humours and supernatural causation for generations to come. The dancing plague became part of Strasbourg's cultural memory, passed down through generations in stories, songs, and local legends. Different versions of the tale emphasized different aspects of the event, depending on the teller's perspective and agenda. Some versions portrayed the dancers as victims of demonic possession, serving as cautionary tales about the dangers of straying from religious orthodoxy. Others presented them as martyrs who had suffered for the community's sins, deserving of sympathy and veneration. The event also influenced art and literature throughout Europe. References to dancing plagues and similar mass manias began appearing in plays, poems, and paintings. The image of people dancing themselves to death became a powerful metaphor for human folly and the dangers of following crowds. The dancing plague was not an isolated incident. Similar events had occurred in Europe before 1518 and would continue to occur for centuries afterward. The earliest recorded dancing mania occurred in 1021 in Kälbeck, Germany, where a group of peasants reportedly danced in a churchyard for an entire year. The 14th century saw several outbreaks of dancing mania associated with religious movements and social upheaval. After Strasbourg, similar events were reported in various European cities throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. These recurring outbreaks suggest that the factors that contributed to the dancing plague, social stress, religious fervor, medical ignorance, were not unique to Strasbourg but were common features of medieval and early modern European society. While we no longer see literal dancing plagues, modern society has experienced similar phenomena of mass psychogenic illness and social contagion. Episodes of shared symptoms without identifiable physical causes continue to occur, particularly in closed communities under stress. Schools have experienced outbreaks of mysterious illnesses that spread from student to student through psychological rather than biological contagion. Workplaces have seen similar episodes, often triggered by fears about environmental contamination or workplace hazards. The rise of social media has created new pathways for behavioral contagion. Online challenges and viral trends can spread dangerous behaviors across vast distances almost instantaneously, affecting thousands of people who have never met each other. Understanding the mechanisms behind the dancing plague can help us recognize and respond to these modern forms of mass psychogenic illness. The same principles that drove people to dance uncontrollably in 1518, social pressure, psychological vulnerability, and inadequate understanding of mental health, continue to influence human behavior today. Chapter 9, Questions for Today. As we reflect on the dancing plague of Strasbourg, we might ask ourselves what stresses exist in our own communities that could potentially manifest in similar ways. What are the modern equivalents of the conditions that made 16th century Strasbourg vulnerable to mass ecological crisis? Economic inequality, social fragmentation, political polarization, environmental concerns all create stress and uncertainty that affect community mental health. While we're unlikely to see people dancing themselves to death, we might see other forms of collective psychological distress. Social media creates new mechanisms for the spread of mass psychogenic illness. Information and misinformation can travel around the world in seconds, potentially triggering widespread anxiety or panic. Online communities can reinforce and amplify psychological symptoms, creating virtual epidemics of distress. How well equipped are our modern institutions, medical, governmental, religious, to recognize and respond to mass psychogenic illness? Have we learned enough from historical examples like the dancing plague to avoid repeating similar mistakes? Modern medicine has a much better understanding of psychology and psychiatry than existed in 1518, but we still struggle with the stigma attached to mental illness. We still sometimes treat psychological symptoms as less real than physical ones, and we still make mistakes in distinguishing between psychological and physical causes of illness. The dancing plague also raises questions about the role of authority in shaping public health responses. The medical authorities in Strasbourg were well-intentioned and following the best knowledge available to them, but their intervention made the crisis much worse. This pattern has been repeated in more recent history. Medical and public health authorities have sometimes made decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but proved to be harmful in retrospect. The dancing plague serves as a reminder that expertise and good intentions are not always enough to prevent catastrophic mistakes. Perhaps most importantly, the dancing plague reminds us of the importance of addressing the underlying social and economic conditions that make communities vulnerable to mass psychological illness. The people of Strasbourg were not inherently different from us. They were ordinary people pushed beyond their limits by circumstances beyond their control. If we want to prevent similar crises in our own time, we need to pay attention to the warning signs: communities under severe stress, inadequate mental health resources, social isolation, economic hardship, and loss of traditional sources of meaning and support. Chapter 10: The Dance That Never Truly Ended. More than 500 years have passed since the last dancer in Strasbourg finally came to rest. The cobblestone streets where hundreds once danced in desperate compulsion now host tourists and students who may have never heard of Frau Troffea or the mysterious force that gripped her city. But the dancing plague of 1518 has never truly ended. It lives on in the questions it raises about human nature, about the relationship between individual psychology and social behavior, about the power of communities to heal or harm their members. The people of Strasbourg thought they were witnessing something supernatural, a divine punishment or demonic possession that defied natural explanation. We understand now that they were seeing something entirely human. The capacity of our minds to create symptoms is real and as dangerous as any physical disease. This understanding brings both comfort and concern. It's reassuring to know that the dancing plague was not the result of supernatural forces beyond human comprehension. But it's troubling to realize that the psychological and social conditions that created it still exist in various forms today. We live in an age of unprecedented connectivity, where ideas and behaviors can spread around the world in seconds rather than weeks. The mechanisms of social contagion that once required face-to-face contact can now operate through digital networks, potentially affecting millions of people simultaneously. At the same time, we have resources that the people of 1518 could never have imagined. We understand psychology and neurology in ways that medieval physicians could not. We have treatments for mental illness that go beyond prayer and bloodletting. We have communication systems that can rapidly disseminate accurate information to counter misinformation and panic. But do we have the wisdom to use these resources effectively? The dancing plague reminds us that knowledge and technology alone are not enough to prevent human suffering. We also need compassion, humility, and the wisdom to recognize when our certainties might be wrong. The story of the Dancing Plague is ultimately a story about the limits of human understanding and the importance of humility in the face of mystery. The medical authorities of Strasbourg were convinced they understood what was happening and had to fix it. Their confidence led them to make decisions that turned a local tragedy into a historical catastrophe. We face similar challenges today. Our medical and scientific knowledge is vastly superior to that of 1518, but we still encounter phenomena that we don't fully understand. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown us how quickly scientific understanding can change and how difficult it can be to make policy decisions in the face of uncertainty. The Dancing Plague teaches us to be cautious about our certainties, to remain open to the possibility that our current understanding might be incomplete or incorrect. It reminds us that the most dangerous mistakes are often made by people who are certain they are right, but the story also offers hope. The people of Strasbourg eventually recognized that their treatment was making the crisis worse, and they changed course. The community survived the catastrophe and learned from it. The dancing eventually stopped, the city recovered, and life went on. Perhaps most importantly, the Dancing Plague demonstrates the resilience of the human spirit. Even in the face of inexplicable suffering, people found ways to care for each other, to maintain hope, and to search for meaning. The dancers themselves, even while trapped in their uncontrollable movements, maintained their humanity and their connections to their community. The families who watched their loved ones dance themselves to exhaustion showed remarkable devotion and persistence. The physicians who prescribed the dancing cure were wrong, but they were trying their best to help. The religious leaders who organized prayers and processions were responding to their community's need for meaning and hope. In the end, the Dancing Plague was not just a story of suffering and death, but also a story of human connection and resilience in the face of the incomprehensible. It reminds us that even in our darkest moments, we are not alone, and that even the most mysterious afflictions can be survived and overcome. The cobblestone streets of Strasbourg are quiet now, but they still whisper the story of a summer when an entire city danced in desperate compulsion, when the cure became deadlier than the disease, and when ordinary people faced the extraordinary with courage and compassion. The dancing has stopped, but the questions remain. And perhaps that is as it should be. Some mysteries are meant to humble us, to remind us of the limits of our understanding, and to inspire us to greater wisdom and compassion in our dealings with the inexplicable aspects of human existence. The Dancing Plague of 1518 stands as a testament to the complexity of human nature, the power of social connection for both good and ill, and the eternal human struggle to understand ourselves and our world. It is a story that continues to dance through the centuries, challenging us to be better, wiser, and more compassionate than those who came before us. In the silence that follows the final notes of the long ago music, we can still hear the echo of hundreds of feet moving in desperate rhythm, reminding us that the dance of human suffering and resilience continues, and that we all have a part to play in determining whether the dance leads to tragedy or to healing. You've made it to the end. That means you enjoyed this dark tale with us. If you did, please consider subscribing to our channel, Lazy Historian, and give this video a thumbs up. I truly appreciate every one of you for watching and joining me on this journey through history's mysteries. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.